Thank you guys for your patience. Let's do my favorite books of this year. Explanations of all of these over on Substack, and I think I've reviewed each of these individually on here. Starting off with Antibot, I know this didn't work for a lot of people, but it really worked for me. I loved the feminist awakening, and while the story wasn't as like strong as some people wanted, I was obsessed with this idea of like packaging one story inside of another, right? At the end of the day, this is actually a story about abuse, and while it seems like it's a story about like a female robot learning to be empowered and like discovering that there is stuff outside of like pleasing her owner, which I know is like really weird language, but it's about a robot. If you read between the lines just a little bit, you see that this is actually a story about someone leaving a very, very, very abusive marriage or like abusive relationship and discovering that there is life outside of like living for another person. And I thought that it was really, really subtle and really, really well done. Next up is Behind You is the Sea by Susan Moadi Daraj. This is a series of vignettes about Palestinian Americans in Baltimore and how their like intergenerational relationships and trauma and sort of family dynamics inform the rest of their lives, right? There's a beautiful story about this female lawyer and her like horrible relationship with her father who has dementia. There's a story about a police officer who returns to Palestine. There's a story about a maid that gets absolutely wild. I loved these stories. There was so much heart and so much humanity into a community that we don't actually hear much about. I had no idea that there was a Palestinian American community in Baltimore, and these stories brought them to life with such vividness. Next up is Anyone's Ghost by August Thompson. This is about two working class boys who meet in New Hampshire. It's constructed as a triptych, so it's three separate chapters that take us over a decade in their lives, and you slowly start to realize that there is something going on. One of the boys is bisexual, one of them is question mark, but I absolutely loved it. The writing was really vivid and evocative of certain times and places. I felt like I was back in New York in the early aughts, going to parties, going to shows. One of the things that I loved is that this took a really, really specific look at like metal culture and show culture, which was really fun for me to revisit. And these boys really, really partied. So I loved it, but your mileage may vary. Next up is Worry by Alexandra Tanner. I did a review of this when I first read it way back in April, and I saw her read a chapter that takes place at Thanksgiving. I immediately bought the book on the spot. It is so funny. This is one of the few funny books that I have on here, but like this is about two sisters. One of them moves in with her other sister who's like living in Brooklyn. It is very, very like millennial. It's very online, and it captures a certain voice so specifically of like the deeply online, deeply annoying person who like, you know, but ultimately the relationship between the two sisters, how they love and hate each other, how they want to be closer, but they are also like beefing all of the time, just really, really moved me. Next up, we have Come and Get It by Kylie Reed. I listened to this and I couldn't stop thinking about it. There was something about the evocative descriptions of each character, how every single person felt so real and so alive that I just like really, really resonated with. I liked Such a Fun Age, which was Kylie Reed's first book. She's operating at a different level in this book where she's constructing an entire world and then creating a comedy of manners inside that world that's very similar to ours, but like a little bit heightened, and it just really, really worked for me. She really has her eye on the money when it comes to money and class and race and the way that all three of those things intersect in such specific ways. They're very small but very powerful, and that's how I know that she knows what she's talking about. Next up is Victim by Andrew Boriga. We read this for my book club. This is about a kid from the Bronx, like me, who goes into digital media and starts terrorizing them with stories that he is making up. It's a satire about the ways that different people in American society will sort of conceive of people from the Bronx, people who are Puerto Rican, people who are from different cultures, who they perceive as lower than, and the way that some people decide to use this to their advantage, right? I am always talking about victimhood on here and on Substack, and this just hit all of the right notes for me. He is so good. Next up is Bad Habit. I read this during Pride Month by Alana Portero. This is a sort of coming-of-age trans story about a trans woman who we follow her from childhood to when she grows up and the way that she sort of worships at the altar of women. I found it to be very powerful. I found it to be very spiritual. The way that she wrote about Madonna and other female celebrities that she just like was obsessed with and was trying to emulate was so good. This takes several twists and turns and it gets a little bit dark. Portero writes about the darkness of Madrid and like its machismo culture, which was very, very good and very, very impactful. And I just absolutely loved it. The way that she writes is so evocative and so sumptuous. I said on Substack that she like lilts and writhes. Like it is so good. Next up is In Universes by Emmett North. This is about a scientist who is looking for dark matter, and you sort of finish that chapter and then it immediately takes you to a different world. Every chapter in this book is about a different parallel life that the main character could have lived, right? And it is so fascinating. This book is about connection. This book is about found family. This book is about queerness in a very specific way. I absolutely was moved by it. I was bowled over by one of the chapters where every woman in one of the worlds and one of the societies sort of turns turns into a horde of animals, right? So the beginning of the chapter is like, my mother is a horde of bees. It was a really powerful metaphor to speak about the different ways that we have different expectations of women and the way that they fracture, the ways that women are allowed to be this and not allowed to be that. And I just thought that North was brilliant, and the way that they wrote about love and longing was so, so powerful. Next up is Splinters by Leslie Jamison. This is the only nonfiction on the list. I loved this book. I did a primer on her because I've read every single one of her books. This is the only nonfiction on the list, but I'm obsessed with Jameson. I love the way that she writes about her life. This is about her COVID divorce and her relationship with her mother and her daughter, her relationship with her ex as she starts dating again. It's so, so, so good. And finally, we have Madwoman by Chelsea Beaker. I absolutely love this. The writing was so stunning. It's hard to really talk about because I don't want to spoil it and you immediately find out what it's about. But like, trigger warnings, the book is a little dark, but it is so beautiful. It was billed as a sort of psychological thriller, but I think it's so much more than that. It's a skewering look at wellness culture, the ways that people want to purify themselves and sanctify themselves and make themselves better to sort of, purge themselves of their trauma, the way that trauma haunts you, the way that trauma stays on you forever. And I was obsessed with it. I thought that the writing was so beautiful, and the end made me absolutely lose my mind. Let me know if you guys have read any of these, and thank you for staying to the end of this. This got way, way, way too long.